What's good, guys? Welcome back. More NASCAR fantasy. Taking a look at this week's 48th annual FireKeepers Casino 400 from Michigan. And I just want to start out by saying, if you watched last week's video, not only did I guess the correct driver that won, but also the correct strategy that won. So, Casey, we're taking a look at this week's race. What are some trends that you see? I'll let you know when I look at Michigan. Kind of comes down to fuel mileage a lot, but also a track where a lot of drivers and teams want to put on their flat-out best performance, because right down the road is Detroit, where most of these manufacturers come from. We'll probably get into this a little bit later on, but a lot of Roush dominance, a lot of Hendrick dominance through the years. But, right now we're looking at a manufacturer not based in Detroit doing some dominating.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think this has always been about the manufacturers. So this year, I think it's going to be a little bit different as far as trends go. I think those trends with the manufacturers are out the window. Even though there are seven multiple-time Cup winners in the field this Sunday, from a fan's perspective, I'm excited to see what the new low downforce package, or really no downforce package, is going to look like on the track. A couple of years ago, these cars were creating a package of around 3,000 pounds. The rule changes last year reduced that to 2,700 pounds, and the package this year is creating around 2,000 pounds. But the package for these Cup cars on Sunday is going to be closer to 1,500 pounds. So, in my opinion, this race is going to be about speed and the ability to pass. These guys are going to be running 220 miles an hour plus at the end of the straightaway. They're going to have to back it down to 180 through the corners. These guys are going to be able to run a little deeper in the corners if they want to, if they're brave enough. I think this is going to be a fast and loose race. I think we're going to see most of the talented drivers up front. This week is going to be less about manufacturers and engineering, pit crews, and strategy, and more about the ability of the driver, I think.
Well, I agree with a lot of that. The Chevys didn't perform real well in qualifying today. It's scary to think that Tony Stewart is the highest qualifying Chevy in third, and it puts a lot of good drivers. A lot of drivers we see run up front a lot, kind of toward the back of the pack. So let's talk about the drivers you like this weekend. And to what you said, I think there's going to be a lot of passing, but I also think it's going to come down to a lot of clean air in the beginning. I still, however, like premier drivers like Dale Jr., even though he's starting back around 27th, I believe, Kevin Harvick 29th, and even sneak Paul Menard in there at not too much of a risk in 32nd, even though maybe you wouldn't consider him a premier driver. I think those are some drivers that I'm really locked in on.
Well, first of all, I think you need to stop stealing my notes, but let me start by saying these young guys that we've been talking about the last few weeks, they really showed up in qualifying this week. Really, really impressive. But I'm going to go with a little bit different strategy this week for this race, and kind of hitting on the qualifying, especially with the Chevys that you talked about. I'm going to start with the drivers that didn't qualify well, just because I think there's an opportunity for these guys to pass on Sunday, and I really expect to see a lot of that. So from a fantasy perspective, I'm looking at guys, like you mentioned, like Kevin Harvick starting in 29th, Dale Jr. 27th. But I'm also looking at your guy from last week and three-time Michigan winner, Kurt Busch, from the 17th spot. So who are your other drivers this week, Ryan?
Well, I like Carl Edwards a lot. Some of the mid-pack guys that I like stood out to me. Casey Kane, who I know has struggled a lot this year, but this is a pretty decent track for him. I think it's a good track for him to get back on pace. He ran well last year. And also Casey Mears. Casey Mears has kind of been hit or miss this year. I think this is going to be one of the hit races for him if we're looking at those low-level guys. And again, neither of them had stellar qualifying runs, so it's not too much of a risk and a lot of upside for those guys.
Yeah, and I'm kind of going the other way from you this week on this. I think I'm going to move Greg Biffle to the top of this list of these mid-tier drivers. He's got 4 Cup wins at this track, back-to-back in 2004 and 2005, back-to-back again in 2012 and 2013. Qualified well this week. That team's kind of turning the corner. We talked the last week and the last 2 weeks. They started off slow early in the season. They're really kind of coming around like the Tony Stewart team. But also like A.J. Allmendinger starting in 20th spot. And like you mentioned earlier, Paul Menard starting 32nd. I think there's really little risk for him starting back there. I think he'll be able to make his way, up into the low to mid-20s by the end of the day. I think it's going to be about moving up and down all day, back and forth. don't think we see another dominant performance like we did a couple of weeks ago from the 78. I think it's going to be back and forth all day.
Well, if I stole your notes, I only stole page 1, because I definitely, in the drivers to stay away from, look at Tony Stewart, as we mentioned, starting third. Just really hasn't had the staying power. Also, I put Greg Biffle and Trevor Bayne on that list. You had mentioned the word slow start to their season. It's been slow race cars. And I think you're right. They had built up. They had kind of gotten some footing up underneath them and ran well. I think this whole, aerodynamics and downforce change is going to pull the rug out from underneath their feet, so to speak, bring them back to square one. Those cars have not gotten any faster, okay? They've gotten and worked on the setups of these cars. The problem is now, with all the downforce and aerodynamic package, you've lost that. So I think the cars that were slow, I think they're going to see a little bit more of that, and I think that showed up in practice and qualifying. They weren't super fast, but they haven't been consistent all, and this is a track, at least with Michigan, where consistency means a lot. When you talk about cars that run up front, you're looking at lap 1 to lap 40 in speeds. I don't think they're going to have that consistency.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm going to touch again on your point with Tony Stewart. I just can't get behind him yet. I can't do it. Starting third is way too high for me. From a fantasy perspective, I just don't see that they have the staying power yet to run up there. And I'm also going to go against you again on Casey Kane this week. He qualified 23rd, and I think he'll be doing good to finish right there. This team has a lot to prove, I think, to the fans, especially the DFS fans. And before I can rely on them finishing races and not tearing up their equipment, I'm going to have to wait on those guys. But this week I'm going to go back to one of the guys that you shoved last week in Chris Buescher. I think these guys are running fast and qualifying, and they just don't have the speed to stay up there with everybody else, like you mentioned last week. That's the trend we'll see again this week.
All right, so while we wrap this up, hope you guys enjoy all the information. Want to give a special shout out to our 3 subscribers, in no particular order, because I just wrote them down. Grubby 5X, which is really 5 times, John Stanton, and Drew Lyons. Appreciate the support that you guys gave us. Anyone else that subscribes will be glad to give you a little props on the channel. Appreciate you guys checking this out. We will be back next week with more videos.